Okay, so delighted to be here today and to introduce a session about how to choose an ICP to work for your organization and how to work with them. We're joined today by Tim Kelsey. Tim has been working in payroll for a long time, and I'm sure known to many of you through his work in training, consulting, and lecturing on the topics of international payroll. Some of you may be rethinking your payroll models at the moment, and you might be thinking, well, how do I choose some different ICPs? Maybe you want to switch ICPs in different countries. Maybe you want to move to a different model. And I think what we're going to have today might help you think through some of those topics. Some of you might be in a position for the first time where you're thinking about, well, almost by accident, now you're operating in another country. As a result of COVID, you might have small pockets of staff scattered in different countries around the world, and now you need to manage them on a remote basis because you need to support the talent in the business, but at the same time remain compliant. So maybe you're in the process now of looking for some ICPs, and I think you'll learn a lot from today's session and from Tim. So I'm going to hand over to Tim in a moment, but just a couple of housekeeping items. We have any questions you want to put to us, we'll happily take them at the end of the session and just pop them into the Q&A tab. We'll pick those up. Tim is going to take us through a presentation based on his experience of selecting and managing in-country payroll providers. And then Tim and myself will have a short discussion thereafter and then open up the discussion to any questions from our attendees. So I suppose without further ado, Tim, I'd like to bring you in and hand over to you. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Good afternoon, one and all. A very warm greeting here from the United Kingdom now through the magic of Zoom. Let's start by doing this good stuff. You guys can now see my screen and you should be able to see a nice big presentation now. You can see that, can you, Trevor? Just confirm for me. Yep, good. That's what we like to see. So let's set the scene. Congratulations, your business is going global, and a surprising amount of businesses are still ringing me and going global. Even with the Ukrainian war raging, I'm quite surprised how many companies are still taking their first foray into operating overseas. So you're going to be opening in country A. Someone's marched into your office. It's always the way. Payroll find out about this thing as a done deal. They've already formed an entity and done all that good stuff. Your first employees are going to start working in just 2 weeks' time. They've already been hired. So one of those bright young things from HR has walked down to see you and told you, oh, we need to pay these people at the end of next month. Will that be a problem? And usually at that point, they disappear out of your office quite promptly whilst you start grinding your teeth. The headcount isn't going to be particularly large. We're going to perhaps start off with just a handful of people. And a quick check around your payroll department quickly reveals that nobody in there can speak the language in country A either. So it takes you all of 10 seconds usually to decide that this is not an activity that we're going to be able to do in-house. So we're not going to go out and look for software and try and do it ourselves. We're really going to have to outsource this operation somewhere. And the first thing really to think about when we are looking for an in-country provider, if we go for the option of looking for an ICP in each country, then we really can go for best in breed. Now, what I mean by that is that certain payroll providers will be targeted either at certain sizes of employers or indeed certain industries. And that could be really important in a country like, let's say, Belgium, where you might need your ICP to have expert knowledge and experiences with a particular collective bargaining agreement. So if we have any construction industry companies listening today, the construction industry collective bargaining agreement in Belgium will set some really complicated rules in terms of paying overtime rates, entitlements to pay, and we're going to need our payroll provider all over that. Instead of getting a general off-the-shelf ICP, let's see if we can find one who really can give proper weight to our known industry problems. Maybe that example of a collective bargaining agreement was too specific, but again, if some of you are listening are from the retail industry, you'll know that retail payroll has its quirks. It's big volume usually, it's fast moving, it's usually processing payroll using time and attendance data rather than fixed salary data. And that makes it a world away from processing, let's say, a banking and insurance payroll. So we can look for someone who's actually specializing in the payroll service that we want. Now, our launch into country A may also mean that we need to use expats from our existing business back home. And what we might be looking for here is not just, in inverted commas, a payroll service. We may be looking for something much wider, particularly tax advice and help with completing the expat's local tax return in country A, for example. Some of your businesses may be fine with the concept of outsourcing, but may not be fine with the concept of subcontracting that arrangement. I once sat in on a payroll tender where my clients thought they were going to be dealing with company A. It transpired that company A had outsourced payroll in this particular jurisdiction to company B. And it was only when we went out to see the payroll operation that actually company B had outsourced it again to company C. And that was an outsourcing too far for my client. So you may feel that, yes, I'm quite happy to pass the pay information off to one partner, but I don't want to see it disappearing down a chain of providers. One way to get started very rapidly in a new jurisdiction, of course, is to use what's known as an employer of record service, or you may see it referred to as a PEO service, a professional employer organisation. And this is simply a fancy term for what a lot of us would think of as being a traditional employment agency, temps. Now, what happens if we hire our employees through the PEO? They become the employees of the PEO rather than our own employees. That means we can take advantage of structures that are already in place in country. And we may have requirements, for example, to pay employees into a bank account in that country from a bank account in that country. We may not have that bank account set up, and if anyone has to try to set up a new bank account recently, you'll know that whichever jurisdiction in the world you're in, all the money laundering rules and regulations we have to jump through now can make that a significantly long process. So if we need to move fast, maybe this is the way to move into a country, at least for the initial few months. What we also find with PEOs is that they can aggregate up their total headcounts in a way that might drive lower costs for you, the ultimate client. And what we mean by that is in lots of jurisdictions in the world, social insurance premiums for items such as work accident insurance could be driven by volumes of the employer. So a small organization with 12 people may just be given a standard premium, whereas a much larger organization can perhaps drive a lower premium because the risk is spread over a much wider group of staff. So all in all, is this a service that you might want from your ICP? Will they be prepared or even able to at least offer an employer record service? It's not for everyone. I'm not a huge fan of it myself, I have to say, for longer than a few months at a time. I think the longer you're using this type of arrangement, the costs do tend to ratchet up over a period of time. And of course, it does have some drawbacks in that it will preclude the people that you've hired from perhaps being members of important parts of your reward structure, primarily employer pension plans, for example. So we've taken the decision to outsource. We need to find a partner. What do we have to do first? Answer, draw up a very detailed invitation to tender. This is a document that you will launch out to your potential partners that will give them all of the information that they need to pitch to you the right level of service, so that it will be comprehensive, it will meet all of your needs. It is also, of course, a document that we will be referring to regularly for years to come. So this document is not a one-off. So this is where you put all of the quirks of your business. And this is not a document where we should be trying to hide things, because if you hide things and don't present the true picture to your outsourced company, you are simply setting yourself up for disputes at some stage in the future. So if you have a particular process that you know is time consuming equals expense, best to be honest about it and list it in this this document. Don't try and hide it away. Now, if we're preparing ITT documents, we first of all should be mindful of the politics in our own organization. And quite often, if you're working for a large company, this is the points where your procurement department may need to get involved. They may have some standard documentation that you can borrow and use as the template to start your ITT document. They may need you to say certain things about the company in that document. So make sure that you involve them at an early stage in the process. Okay, how long should an ITT be? Well, as long as it takes to put all of the information in, which is a bit of a slick answer, isn't it? But this is, for me, more is better here. I think we're looking for a detailed document, not a high-level helicopter view of the organisation. So the more you can put in there, so that you can use this document as a reference point when we're talking to the ultimately successful provider in 2 or 3 years' time. You'll be able to point to sections and say, look, I told you about this particular thing. Here it is in the ITT. You did see this when you tendered for the work. So more is better than less here. Now, who are you going to send it to? Well, first place to start, if you're going into a particular country, why not start with the professional payroll body in that country? They will usually have a list of accredited suppliers. So we're thinking about bodies such as the CIPP, the Chartered Institute of Payroll Professionals in the UK, the American Payroll Association in America, the South African Payroll Association, and so on. They'd be a really great place to start for information on potential providers. Good old LinkedIn. Again, don't hide your light under a bushel. This is time to get out about, milk your contacts and use the internet, and reach out to fellow payroll professionals around the globe for some suggestions as to where to start. We're looking, usually I aim to try and send an ITT out to up to 10 companies. I fully expect 2 to not reply at all. And 1 or 2 responses will be so ludicrously cut and paste, I won't want to do more than give a quick glance at them. So that's why I'm starting with 10, on the assumption that really I'll probably only end up reading 6 of them in absolute detail. Now, of course, you can find out details on payroll providers for yourself. How do we find anything out in modern life? We Google it, don't we? But what I want to suggest to you is the how of how you're going to Google these potential suppliers in country A. And my simple piece of advice to you is Google that search using the language of the country you need the services in. If that language is a global language, such as French or Spanish, then make sure you put the name of the country in the Google search somewhere as well. Now, for those who may not have realized this, if you use Chrome as your browser, and other browsers do the same thing as well, you can set a setting on there that allows for instant translation. So when you do your Google search in another language, you can set the responses that come back to instantly translate into English should you need to do that. And I thought I'd set you this little exercise to try. So let's say, for example, we need to purchase a payroll service for a small employer in Normandy, employing perhaps 20 or 30 staff in the Norman capital, Rouen. So if you start by Googling accounting firms providing payroll services to employers in Rouen. So we've done our Google search in English, and you'll get a list of reasonable providers back by doing that. Now take that search and stick it into Google Translate, and it will now become Cabinet d'expertise comptable au service de la paie des employés à Rouen. Now, if you stick that into Google and look what comes back the second time, you'll see that that search will pick up some of the smaller, more local providers as well that the first search had actually missed off. And those could be the ideal partners for your operation in France. So try Googling in the local language. The most important document that we will produce as part of the tendering process once we've picked a potential partner will be the statement of work. And this, of course, is what your ICP is agreeing to do for you for the money that will be changing hands. Often, clients will simply wait to be handed a standard statement of work from the potential provider. But I actually think it's a good idea to take the initiative and draft up your own statement of work. And really present that to suppliers for comparison with their standard statement of work. And when you're working out that draft, then it only needs to be a simple bullet form document. We're not looking at the absolute detail that will go into the final version at this stage. But we'd be looking at what are the registration obligations? Who's going to do all of those good things? Go and register the company with all the bodies they need to be registered with. What the reporting obligations are. More and more we expect our payroll reports to be sent electronically to the authorities and for that to work seamlessly from our payroll provider. So we need to make sure that they're going to be doing that. What are the payment obligations? How do we actually pay the statutory authorities and indeed the employees as well? Documentation that we might need that payroll provider to issue. So again, sticking with my earlier example of Belgium, when an employee leaves you in Belgium, there are a series of documents that need to be produced. And we want to make sure that our payroll provider is going to do all of that for us, because if they push it back to us, we're going to need that local language expert to help us with the production of those. We need to think about our interactions with other statutory bodies, so not just the tax and social security authorities. So, for example, many countries have a requirement that the company will take on a given percentage of its workforce from the disabled community. And if they don't do that, then there's usually a punitive tax charge to pay, and there's usually a separate body that would deal with that. Statutory returns are, for statistical purposes, are another great example. Remember, government's mantra is it's very easy to spend other people's time and money, so they're quite happy to bombard you with requests ever more complex of statistics on your workforce, so that they go off and do important numbers for the that country's economy. But the simple mantra to remember, if it's not on the statement of work, then they either won't do it at all, or they will charge extra for it. Now, it's not necessarily a deal breaker that they're going to charge extra for a particular activity. We simply need to know what that charge is likely to be, how it's going to be measured, so we can set a realistic budget for what the service is going to cost us. I think the deal breaker quite often turns out to be that they simply won't do the particular service at all. And it's best to find that out before you shake hands on a contract than afterwards. Lastly, we may also need special services as well, interacting with bodies that are not statutory authorities, but they're important to our workforce. And the most common example of that would be a pension plan of some sort, where we might need to feed complex data to that provider to get the necessary benefits calculated correctly. Okay, we're going to delve now into what we're looking from the ICP when they've won some business and they're actually onboarding that new business into their client portfolio. So we really want to ask some probing questions about how this experience is going to work. So don't be afraid to probe quite deeply into the level of training that the ICP staff have on processes and procedures. And also remember that most ICPs of any size will potentially have a specialist onboarding team, which will then pass you on to a business as usual team. We want to look at how that process works as well, because we don't want to be just thrust onto the business as usual team without being absolutely sure that all of the onboarding is complete. So ask to see the documentation that covers all of these processes, and you would expect in any beauty parade, particularly when you've got down to perhaps the last 2 or 3 potential candidates, you want an extensive walk through this process. We would expect the ICP to have some very standard procedures for new customer setup, which should be something that they do all the time. Ask them about their data gathering tools. What are they actually using here? And is that going to be easy for you to use and interact with? Do they have the IT skills in-house to allow them to build any processing platforms that you need to produce interfaces of data that you may require as well? I spend a lot of my time when I'm teaching groups actually emphasizing the importance of cultural training. So the thing I would say to groups is, don't be fooled by this globalization talk that we see in the press all the time, when people say, oh, the world is shrinking. The world is not shrinking. It's not getting smaller. What globalization has done is it accentuates the differences between cultures as more and more different cultures come into close contact with each other for extended periods of time. Now, Trevor, I'm going to ask you this question, so if you can unmute yourself. Let's say you're working with a payroll provider in South Africa. You want something done, and you're really rather keen that it's done fairly quickly. And they reply, yes, Trevor, we're going to do that just now. When are they actually going to do it, Trevor?
I think it's a loaded question, Tim. So give me the answer.
If a South African says to you they are going to do something just now, that could be anything between in the next 10 minutes and in a month's time. So if, Trevor, you need something done in South Africa and you genuinely need it done in the next few hours, you need to say to the South African, when they say, I'll do that just now, you have to say, no, you need to do it now. And that's the phrase in South African English that tells people they actually have to do it now. And that's a silly little example, but it is an example of how culture is important, how we need to understand how we're going to interact with our newfound partners in another country. So I do recommend invest some time in learning how both general culture and also specifically business etiquette works in the country where you are buying payroll services. One of the ways to do this very, very simply, very easily, very cheaply, I'm recommending a series of guides here, the Xenophobes guides. They have some excellent little reads. These are not particularly thick books. They're written in a very humorous way, so they're very easy to read, but they do tend to be airily accurate. The one on the English is absolutely spot on, as is the one on the Irish as well, Trevor. So I do recommend those as a simple guide if you've not had much dealing with individuals from the country where you're having to open up for the first time. It's well worth investing a little bit of time in working out what are the cultural norms in this country. How am I going to get the best out of working with this ICP? I think some of the best experiences I've had with payroll providers as well is where they've recognized this and they've actually put some serious efforts in. So just a month ago, I did a session for a well-known payroll providers team in terms of Japanese business culture and etiquette, because they were taking on a significant Japanese client for the first time, and they wanted to spend some time thinking about how that might interact with the business. I worked for my sins. I was at one time the European payroll manager for TK Maxx, the retailer. You may have heard of TK Maxx. They are the world's poshest jumble sale. If you've ever been in one of their stores, fighting for a bargain. I was in a TK Maxx store only at the weekend, and we opened in Germany. We had one of the best payroll providers I've ever worked with overseas. And just to give you an idea of how good this group were, the staff that processed TK Maxx's German payroll went to their boss and said, look, we need to understand the English better, because the payroll was managed from Watford in the UK. We are prepared to come in early one morning a week if you will arrange English lessons for us. And I thought that was a great sign of a payroll provider actually wanting to really be in tune with their client as well. So they did that. They used to come in at 7:30 on a Wednesday and work on their English until 8:30. It was very pleasing to see that. You might need to think about who exactly you're going to be paying in a country as well, because we might not just be talking about employees. So are we looking to pay pensioners, for example, people who receive an income after they've retired, because we may need different services to process that payroll? I hope you're all familiar with the concept of workers as opposed to employees. We're not talking blue collar versus white collar here. We're thinking more, and I'll use a brand name, of the recent cases that have involved companies like Uber. Uber are not the only company undergoing these issues. But a lot of countries in the world now have this halfway house status to employment, and they'll classify people as workers instead of employees. And of course, this is what Uber has been losing lots of court cases on in the recent past. So those people will have some of the aspects of employment about their relationship, but not all. And they may need processing in a different way. There may be additional returns to do on them, for example. Non-executive directors and other officers as opposed to employees. And also full-blown contractors as well. They all may need to be processed. So you need to make sure that your ICP can cope with all of these variations. Now, I've used an example on the slide here from actually one of my clients who's going through a tendering process at the moment. And one of the jurisdictions they operate in is France. And in France, it is not possible for legal firms to directly employ their barristers. They have to maintain a self-employed status so that they are seen as being independent when they are working in court. So it's the law that it has to be done that way. Of course, these people aren't really what we'd call genuinely self-employed. They want an employment relationship like any other senior employee. So that relationship requires that an invoice is issued to the company for services, and it has to be a VAT invoice. But in effect, that invoice is actually arranged by the engager, not the service provider. So that's a very specific set of requirements, and you really need a provider to be able to get their head around that and understand it fully. Otherwise, chaos will ensue. Make sure your potential provider has got the necessary resources in place, both to onboard you and going forward as well. Those of you who have met me before and know that I spend a lot of my time doing training will say, well, of course, Tim, of course you'll say at this point, people should spend a lot of time on training payroll people. There's no interest like self-interest. But we want to make sure that our ICP has some commitments here. And that they're running a CPD system of some sort where they require their employees to keep up to date and to log what they do. And for those of you listening today, don't forget to log what you are doing today. It's part of your CPD after all. Make sure that there are adequate resources available if new business gets won. One of the questions I always ask is how many new prospects are you chasing at the moment, and how many would you have to win before you would close to taking on new business? If companies profess to having unlimited resources and they wouldn't close to new business, then perhaps those are the ones to avoid. The prudent companies will say, well, we can win maybe 3 tenders simultaneously, and we would take those on, but we couldn't take on a 4th, so we would actually then close to new business for the duration of implementing those clients that we've already won. Ask them what their per head investment is in their people in terms of training costs and what professional qualifications they require their people to have. For example, in America, you would expect everyone to have an APA qualification. If people didn't, you'd want to know why, really. It's the professional body of the industry. You expect people to be appropriately qualified to undertake our profession. Language skills, really important thing. I gave my German client as the example. You need to be able to communicate adequately with your provider, and particularly if it is in a jurisdiction where English isn't necessarily an obvious skill set. So Japan would be a country where I'd see that as being potentially a problem. The amount of calls I've had to payroll providers in Japan where everyone smiles and nods but says very little, mainly because they're not confident enough about their English. That's not going to be potentially a good thing for you guys if you're then on the end of that for the duration of a 3 or 5 year payroll contract. Lastly, think about how you're going to keep up to date with changes in that jurisdiction. So what effort does that ICP put in to informing and educating its customers? Ask to see examples of customer bulletins, particularly when major changes are being sought. So an example at the moment is we have the UK introducing the new health and social care levy. So if I was looking at a payroll service in the UK, I'd perhaps want to ask a payroll provider, what have you circulated around your potential client base as to this change, and just look at the quality of what they issue. And just because you've outsourced it, that doesn't mean that you don't need to know anything about it. The mantra to remember when you sign that contract is that you never outsource the responsibility. The compliance authorities will turn to you, your company, with fines and penalties if things are got wrong. And it's your company's reputational at risk as well. So the buck stops with you guys, remember that. So you need to know the basics of the jurisdiction in which you're operating. You need to know where you could check up on information about payroll processes. And I would use the official government websites really to style questions to your ICP. So I have lots of go-to websites, but let's take France as an example. We have the new BOSS website in France, the Bulletin Officiel pour la Sécurité Sociale, and that has some really quite detailed operating instructions on it. It's not particularly difficult to use, so you can drill in and you can ask a question along the lines of, I've seen this in section 3 of this guide. Can you explain how that works in practice? And now you've got a better focused question. You brought them around to a reference point that they use themselves, and they'll be able to perhaps then understand better, more fully what is going on there. One of the things that I also find is that you will often be in a situation where a payroll provider will say, it must be done this way. What they really mean is, we do it this way. And if someone is saying to you, it must be done this way, don't be afraid to push back and say, okay, show me the legislation that actually confirms that statement. And often as not, they'll then push back and say something along the lines of, well, it is very irregular. Remember, people often like things a particular way because that's the way they've always done them. They haven't necessarily thought that a process can be carried out in a different way. And questioning your ICP, it's a very common problem that I come across where a client has said, they never told me that. And the answer from the ICP is often, you didn't ask. Very few outsourcers, and indeed very few people in business, will answer a question they have not been asked. And indeed in payroll, that's always our mantra when the auditors come around, isn't it? Never answer a question you haven't been asked. But also, let's be a bit more charitable here. The payroll provider could very reasonably assume a level of knowledge in you that you simply don't have because you're not from that particular country. You know, how would you know this point? But they don't know that you don't know. So there are no stupid questions when you are talking to an ICP. So always ask for detail and always push back with questions like, is there anything else you think I should consider about this point? Or is there anything that you're surprised that I haven't asked you about that you would take into account usually? Questions like that will perhaps prompt them to think a bit more widely around the subject. Now, this next slide, I'm afraid, does dive into quite a level of detail, but it's an area that if I had £1 for every time I've seen this go wrong, I would now be a retired payroll consultant, and I wouldn't ever need to work again. And that's the area of the payroll journal, the accounting document that's actually going to place the results of our carefully crafted payslips into the company's books. And they're often a source of major trouble and problems. And the way to approach these documents is to realize that many of the providers out there, even though they may be accounting firms themselves, simply view your GL report as that. It's a report, and all they've got to do is basically make sure that the total debits match the total credits and it balances. That is not true. They need to understand exactly what the journal is doing. Now, I've taken this extract. It's from one of my clients I'm dealing with at the moment. And the sharp-eyed of you perhaps will have spotted that, yet again, this is about a French payroll. You can see from the entries there. So this particular payroll provider had produced these journals, and of course, they always balance, the debits equal the credits. And yet my client had a very large shortfall on their books. And it wasn't until they called me in, and we did an exercise to actually reconstruct the general ledger back from payslips. Remember, the payslip is the only real source of truth in any payroll system. We discovered entries like the one you see here. So you can see the cost center is the same all the way down. Yes, they've got it to balance, but what have they done? They've posted a credit of 1263 and a debit of 1263 to the same cost center. Result, 0. That has not actually posted any cost into the books. So you may need to really roll your sleeves up and go into this granular level of detail when you are setting up with a new ICP to absolutely make sure that your payroll journal will do exactly what you want it to do. My client that this comes from, they'd had a problem like you can see here on the screen. And by the time we got involved, we were looking at a difference on the books of about 350,000 euros. So no one large number was a large number. Indeed, every month it was really rather a small number. It's just that it went on for 3.5 years, and it had grown into being really quite a big number. The employees have been paid correctly. The statutory authorities have been paid correctly, but the correct cost wasn't sitting on the books because, in effect, a small portion of everyone's payslip had disappeared off the journal. So put some effort into making sure that is correct. And the effort that you should put into that is through the payroll reconciliation. And you should do this independently of the payroll provider. Remember, what we're doing is a three-way check. We are looking at the total amount of payments that we've actually sent out to our employees as net pay and the statutory authorities and other third parties such as pension companies. We compare that to the statutory totals to date for all of those items on our books. And then we do a third check to our accounts. Remember that when we run the payroll journal, we post numbers onto control accounts. So for tax and social security deductions, those go as a credit on a control account. And then the corresponding debit is when we pay the social security authorities, the tax authorities, etc. So those control accounts must reconcile back to a 0 balance when all of the accounting transactions have gone through. Don't just expect that to work by magic. You will need to put some effort into that. And part of that effort really is evidencing all of these controls. So really don't take things on trust is my advice here. You need to see some evidence that the ICP has done what they are contracted to do in that statement of work. And these days, the evidence should be electronic. So we need to evidence the various payroll submissions that have been made on our behalf. Remember that all systems these days pretty much will produce an electronic receipt that will prove that your payroll provider has actually sent the documentation that they say they have. We should be able to obtain a receipt from the payover process of paying the statutory authorities as well. That should be a receipted operation. And finally, these days, because of all the online facilities that exist, most tax authorities will have some form of dashboard available to employees. So we should be able to go online on that dashboard, view the account, and make sure that all the transactions that we think have happened have actually gone through. Whether you do that yourself independently or whether you simply ask to see screenshots of it from your payroll provider, I'm not much bothered which way you organise things, as long as you do this. And if you're describing a particular tax system to your auditors and you say, yeah, all of the activities are posted up on this dashboard, the next thing the auditor will say is, and do you evidence that? Do you actually check it yourself? So make sure that is done. I was out running a training course on Irish payroll with a company last year. And I made this very point in the course, and said to them, so have you been on and looked at your ROS dashboard? And everyone looked at everyone else, as is often the way. And the answer came back, no, we haven't. Okay, let's go on and do that now. So we did that. And I looked at the dashboard, and I looked again, and I looked a third time, and my blood ran cold. Why did it run cold? Because they hadn't paid their PAYE for 6 months. Now, they thought they had. Let's be clear about this. They're not a dodgy company. But they had not actually paid the tax authorities for 6 months. And the evidence was there on their dashboard. They would have seen it 6 months ago had they been in and done that check on a monthly basis. The outstanding sum was over €1 million. Now, it transpired at the end of that story, because I asked them to keep me informed as to what had gone on there. It transpired that their colleagues in finance had changed the company bank account details without actually changing the direct debit to Irish Revenue. I still can't get my head around why Irish Revenue had not contacted them separately and asked for the €1 million. Let's put that down to the 3 most dreaded words in the English language: because of COVID. I suppose, in a sense, Irish Revenue really weren't that bothered, because they simply got the clock running on charging interest on those late payments. So for them, in a way, it was actually a revenue earner. So do these basic checks and make sure you're evidencing the controls. Don't just take it on trust that the payroll provider has got all the stuff right. We want you to have a long-standing and happy relationship with your ICP. So how are you going to measure all of that? So this is an area that you need to discuss in depth with your potential partner. So the usual way is to agree some KPIs, key performance indicators, and how we're going to use these and measure them. And we would relate these back to a service level agreement. We're expecting there to be an overall minimum accuracy level agreed. Do not accept an accuracy level less than 99%. Certainly some of the bigger providers will attempt to squeeze in a number of 98, or even I've seen recently 96%. That is not acceptable. 99% is reasonable. Things will always go wrong. We are all human beings, but they ain't going wrong more than 1% of the time. That would simply not be an acceptable service. The problem, if you're buying a payroll service for a particular country and the numbers on the payroll are small, so under 100 employees, that's going to be quite difficult, because if we have just 2 employees with a problem, that's going to see our minimum accuracy level broken, and that could be for no fault, in inverted commas, of the payroll provider. So if we've got those smaller providers, we do need to think more carefully about how we're going to record these. Now, one idea I would put to you, and I would document this, I would have it in the agreement with the payroll provider, is I think you should sit there and go, right, what is a reasonable amount of my time that I have to spend on this arrangement every month? And I'm going to add in a safety net there for just general queries and other stuff that happens as normal processing. But let's set that budget of time, and then let's make sure that we record how much time this is required to manage this, this relationship. And if we see that budget being breached, then that probably indicates that there is some sort of a problem. Now, that problem might be with the ICP. They might be needy and keep bothering us with stuff that they could sort out themselves. But equally, it could be a problem with us as well. We might have a problem internally within the business. And remember, it's ever so easy to spend other people's time and money. Let's make sure it's not your time that's being spent on this. Once we've selected our partner, think about the governance that you want to apply, and we start that with a very rigorous ITT process. As I said, that ITT that went out, keep it, do not dispose of it. We are going to use it as a working document back with our ICP. Make sure you keep all of your notes from the selection process as well. And also the submission that your ICP made when they actually won the business, so that we've got those to refer back to and say, look, this isn't a particular issue that's a surprise. It's not new. It was in the invitation to tender. You said you could do X, Y, and Z. Actually, over the last 3 months, you've not been able to get near that. So it's a great way to keep their nose to the grindstone, so to speak. Your operational controls, we're looking for that payslip accuracy, what metrics are going to be applied to work this out, and how relevant are they to you as a customer. And one of the things that I would consider doing is actually saying, right, as part of this process, there will be a regular partner audit annually. And what would I put in that audit, and who's actually going to undertake that audit? Well, you might be able to talk to your own internal audit team, and perhaps they'll be keen on taking this particular task on. You might actually think about doing it yourself. The sorts of items I would include in here. So partner staff training, how they're trained on processes and procedures, documentation, how that's used. So talk through its application, how it's kept up to date, how they evidence their processes and procedures, case management, and how we escalate a case as well. So what's the process for escalating? How quickly can I escalate something that's very serious? In some of the more traditional aggregator models, you know, we can raise an issue and it can be 6 or 8 weeks before we hear a reply back. We don't want to be in that sort of position. We want to be able to move things forward rapidly should they, to us, be a serious issue. How does that ICP evidence its business as usual checks and controls? Are they using checklists, for example, and who reviews those checklists and make sure that they've been signed off correctly? Look at the IT skills that they built around processing and interfaces. They can always be an area of trouble for a business. Always worth looking at those as well, particularly when systems are being upgraded. How are the KPIs being monitored to the SLA, and what the process is if an SLA has been breached. And don't be afraid to ask them, if you're seeing a breach of your SLA, have you breached any other clients' SLAs? How many have you breached? Ask those uncomfortable questions, because it might indicate that there is a pattern there unfolding. Lastly, controls and compliance. We've been over that already. You want the evidence, you want the reconciliation to prove that everything is working tickety-boo. Well, that's all I've got to say on that particular subject. So Trevor, shall I stop sharing the screen?
You can leave that up there, Tim, just in case anyone wants to get in touch with you. Happy to leave that up there. Look, Tim, thanks a million for sharing your insights and lots of practical tips along the way from your experience. I'm sure there's an awful lot that we can learn from that. Like, depending on what stage we're at in our career. I think we've time for a couple of questions, and I'll take one here. Here's one for you. What skills do you think you require from someone who's relatively new to international payroll to be able to manage a new ICP and that new ICP selection process. So what are the kind of, if you were running that team, what would they need to have themselves, or what would they need to see in their team?
So I think international is something that should be a development in your career. Very few of us will start off our payroll lives in an international setting. So having some good, solid home country payroll experience would be great to start with. I think you need an open mind is one of the things to sort of really emphasize. We don't want people who are just used to processing things in a particular way. It's the ability to spot that around the globe, whilst the fundamental process of gross to net calculating is pretty similar, different countries will do things in different ways, and we need to have the openness of mind to accept that. So an example would be, let's compare the UK with the Republic of Ireland. Tax allowances in the UK, where we reduce the gross pay before we calculate tax, versus tax credits in the Republic of Ireland, where we calculate the tax on the true gross pay and then reduce the tax that's been calculated. And of course, once you've done that in the Republic of Ireland, it's not too difficult to work out how tax is being calculated in, say, Canada or the Netherlands. So it's that ability to realise that things can be done in a different way, and then to, when you come across the same broad principle in another country, to go, yeah, I understand how that works now. And really feeding on from that would be some inquisitiveness as well. You've got to be someone who likes to probe behind the scenes and ask the questions. Remember, there are no daft questions when it comes to international payroll. I think what there often are no questions asked when there should be. So demand answers, really probe into what's going on there. I think the cultural piece as well is really important. You will need to have the ability to interact with clients from all over the world, and to know what people are really saying to you when they say something. If you hear phrases from an Indian colleague along the lines of, I will see, it may be difficult. What are they really saying to you, Trevor? They're saying, no, I'm not going to do it. Go away. But they don't want to say no to you. They would hate to say no to you. It's cultural anathema to them. And you're going to need to be able to steer them back on track and say, no, look, come on, let's see if we can get this show on the road. So those are some key skills I'm looking for in an international person. I think the ability to read a lot is very important as well, because any payroller is responsible for UK payroll, Irish payroll. They'll know how much material comes out of government. If you're now running payroll for 8 or 10 countries, you've just increased that by a factor of 8 or 10. And whilst your payroll provider may help you with all of that, remember, you've got to be able to manage them and know what's going on. So you're going to have to keep yourself up to date on all of this stuff as well, just to make sure that the payroll provider is doing what you want them to do. What else would we be looking at from our team? We always say in payroll, it's an eye for detail, isn't it? Well, I think the other thing that we really do need to be all over is that statement of work and the contract that we've got with the ICP. We do not want to be in a situation where we are constantly referring to said contract. We just need to have the confidence in what we're saying to the ICP, that when we know that this has been agreed in this particular document, we are going to hold them to that standard. So you will have to make yourself very familiar with those documents as well, and have the confidence to push back when you think the ICP is perhaps chancing their arm, as we say.
Just, I think one final one, Tim, to wrap. I'm just conscious of time. when we're talking in this presentation about ICPs, and that's basically going out and finding your own in-country payroll provider in country. So you have the capability and wherewithal to do that, and you like that model. How would you contrast that, let's say, to someone that maybe has looked at the traditional global payroll aggregator, and would you see any benefits of working with an ICP?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, it's that vision with the aggregator model of one throat to choke, as someone once said to me, and that can seem very very attractive, particularly if people are time poor, they're busy, they want to get on with something, they want to dump a problem on someone else's lap. But the reality is of those arrangements, is it ever really one throat to choke? Because a lot of those aggregators do end up subcontracting their services to their own ICPs in country. And that, I think, is the single most difficult issue. It is the area that I hear the most comments, complaints about, where I'm with an aggregator, I cannot talk directly to the person who is actually doing my payroll. And we have to be aware of how information can get mangled on a route if it has to go via a third party. I had a case a couple of years ago. It was a client who, a retailer, they'd opened an operation in Germany. And what had happened was that a penalty notice had come through, and the client, not unreasonably, had said, "Why have I received this penalty notice?" So off they sent their query to the aggregator, who then sent it on to their ICP, and 4 weeks later a response came back, and this response was put in front of the client. Now, the client looked at it, scratched their heads and said, "I do not understand a word of this." They called me. They sent it over to me. I could see instantly what had happened. The ICP had written a response in German, and they'd stuck it through Google Translate. So whilst it was a collection of English words, it actually didn't really explain what the problem was. And that told me that the aggregator hadn't actually read it themselves. So we pushed back with a detailed query, and I managed to piece together half an explanation from it, and we wrote a more detailed question back to the aggregator, emphasising a couple of points. Blame me, the same thing happened the second time around. So they pushed it back to the ICP in Germany. They'd written another detailed reply in German, stuck it into Google Translate, and your man at the aggregator had not bothered to read it a second time. And I think for me, that is really an illustration of the difference here. I want to be able to speak to the person who is doing my payroll. I want to hear their explanation. I want to hear the options on particular issues. I will not get that with the aggregator model. But I think whichever one you go down, I always say to clients, try and be the biggest fish you possibly can in the pond that you are swimming in. If you go for a very large provider and you have a payroll of 50 people and their usual client base has 5,000 people on the payroll, whether it's an ICP or whether it's an aggregator, you are not going to be top of their priority list. That is just reality. So try and swim in a pond where you will have some clout. And that is one of the best ways to get decent service.
Tim, thanks very much for answering those questions. We're a little bit over time. I'd like to thank everyone who attended here today for joining us. Tim, your insights were superb, and hopefully our audience here today, if they're using some of your tips and practical advice, will be in a position to drive their international payroll needs forward in a more flexible way. Thanks all, and that concludes our webinar today. Thanks again.